Καλώς ήρθατε. Καλησπέρες. Καλησπέρα. Λοιπόν, πάμε. Με συγχωρείτε λίγο για την καθυστέρηση. Καλησπέρες. Τέλεια. Λοιπόν, καλώς ήρθατε, μόλις ανοίξαμε και σας περιμένουμε εδώ. Καλώς ήρθατε στο στριμάκι μας σήμερα το μεσημέρι. Λοιπόν, πού είναι το tablet μου, για να μπορούμε να σημειώνουμε κιόλας το τι θα πει ο Powell. Όχι, αυτό θέλω, σωστά. Τι κάνουμε, καλησπέρα σε όλους. Εγώ είμαστε, παιδιά, με συγχωρείτε που είχαμε και λίγη αναμονή. Καλησπέρα Paul, καλησπέρα Βάγκο, καλησπέρα Star Brown. Καλησπέρα Γιάννο. Πώς Βαγγελάκο. Νίκη Τάπα, μάλλον μου κλέβεις το όνομα εσύ, αλλά καλησπέρα. Πάμε για πάτο, δεν ξέρουμε, θα δούμε. Πού σε ρεσεύω, καλησπέρα. Μην ανοίξει αν δεν βαρέσει. Τι πείτε, ευρώ θα μας κατεμοιάζει. Ρε, τι πείτε σου βάρεσε 50 ευρώ. Τα βλέπουμε μαζί, στο private. Καλησπέρα Πελαγία μου. Πού είσαι ο Δωρακό, γεια σου Ντάριους. Πείτε την καλησπέρα σας, οπότε καλώς ήρθατε. Καλώς ήρθατε όλοι. Και έτσι ξεκινώντας, πάμε να το ξεκινήσουμε full δυναμικά το στριμάκι. Οπότε μην ξεχάσετε να το πατήσετε το like. Να δούμε πόσο θα το φτάσουμε σήμερα. Sorry, ένα λεπτάκι, για να πάμε να δούμε. Όπα, κάναμε εδώ. Δώστε με ένα λεπτάκι να βρω την ομιλία. Τι θεωρητικά είναι για εδώ να την ανοίξει. Αλλά δεν το έχει εδώ. Εντάξει, το έχει και το CNBC στη χειρότερη. Οπότε θα τα δούμε και τα δύο. Εδώ θα δούμε ποιο θα ανοίξει τα δύο, αλλά έτσι κι αλλιώς καλυμμένοι μας στο κομμάτι. Μια χαρούλα. James, καλησπέρα ρε φίλε. Καλώς ήρθες. Τσίμι μέσα, καλησπέρα Τόνι, καλησπέρα Μπιλί. Κώστας, Γιώργος, Μάνινος, Μάγκες, καλώς ήρθατε. Σε 5 λεπτάκια θα ξεκινήσει και η ομιλία. Να πω λίγο κάτι για να το ξεκαθαρίσω, γιατί πολλοί μπερδεύονται με το τι ομιλίες είναι η κάθε ομιλία και τέτοια. Δεν είναι ομιλία για άνοδο επιτοκίων, κάτι τέτοιο. Αυτό που κάνει είναι μπροστά στο Κογκρέσο, θα τον ρωτήσουν πράγματα. Αν θυμάστε, το είχαμε κάνει και πριν από κάποιους μήνες στο συγκεκριμένο stream. Είναι μια ομιλία που τον ρωτάνε πράγματα από το Κογκρέσο, ουσιαστικά σαν να λέμε η διοίκηση του, του Πρωθυπουργού της Αμερικής, ας μην πω το όνομα, για λόγους αλγορίθμου. Τον ρωτάνε διάφορα πράγματα για το πώς πηγαίνει η οικονομία, για το πώς βλέπει να συνεχίζουν, πόσο τους βολεύει και εκείνους οι πράξεις οι οποίες κάνει, πόσο εκείνοι μπορούν να βοηθήσουν τον Powell, όλο αυτό το κομμάτι γενικά. Οπότε θα δούμε και το τι θα πει πάνω σε αυτό το κομμάτι. Έχει ομιλία και αύριο, αν και πιστεύω ότι τα πιο σημαντικά πράγματα και τις πιο σημαντικές και βαριές ερωτήσεις θα τις απαντήσει και θα τον ρωτήσουν σήμερα. Οπότε αύριο δεν ξέρω αν θα το ανοίξουμε το ίδιο αντίστοιχο stream. Θα δούμε το πού θα την αφήσουν την ομιλία. Οπότε ανάλογα και με το πού θα την αφήσουν και εκείνοι θα δούμε και αύριο αν θα έχει νόημα ή όχι. Σίγουρα θα περίμενα σχόλια σχετικά με το πώς βλέπει το κομμάτι του Μαρτίου, δηλαδή το τι ίσως θα περίμενε για τα νούμερα. Μπορεί να μας δώσει και κάνα σχόλιο για τα αυριανά νούμερα, ας πούμε, γιατί αύριο να θυμίσω ότι έχουμε τα jolts, να το δείξω κιόλας. Αύριο έχουμε jolts το μεσημέρι και non-farm, ADP non-farm employment change στις 3 και 4 και τα jolts είναι στις 5. Αν θυμάστε, στην τελευταία του ομιλία τον είχαν ρωτήσει και του λένε, και του λένε παίρνετε νέα νωρίτερα από ότι βγαίνουν στο κοινό, και λέει αν είναι κάτι πολύ σημαντικό εγώ προσωπικά ή κάνα δυο ακόμα μέλη τύπου η Vice President ή κάτι τέτοιο, μπορεί να τα έχουμε το προηγούμενο βράδυ, ας πούμε. Αύριο λοιπόν έχουμε τα Jolts, οπότε δεν είναι παράλογο να δούμε σχόλια σήμερα σχετικά με τα αυριανά νούμερα. Και σχόλια για τα αυριανά νούμερα μπορεί να είναι τύπου ότι να δούμε λίγο το πώς θα το σχολιάσει από την άποψη του τι θεωρεί του προηγούμενου μήνα τα νούμερα, ότι ήταν απλώς ένα blimp, όπως το έχουν ονομάσει, τύπου ένας μήνας ανωδικός που έτυχε να ανέβουν κάποια νούμερα, ή είναι όντως πλέον ο πληθωρισμός και όλη αυτή η προσπάθεια αρχίζει και παίρνει μια άλλη εικόνα και αρχίζει ο πληθωρισμός λίγο και ανεβαίνει και βλέπουμε ξανά δυνατή αγορά εργασίας μετά από αυτούς τους 8 σερί μήνες που είχαμε μια πολύ καλή αισθητή πτώση. Οπότε θα δούμε πώς θα σχολιάσει. Νομίζω εκεί θα εστιάσει ο περισσότερος κόσμος. Πιθανώς, ίσως ερωτηθεί ξεκάθαρα για το ποια θα είναι η επόμενη άνοδος επιτοκίων, αν θα είναι 25 ή 50. Δεν νομίζω ότι θα απαντήσει σε αυτό. Θα πει ότι θα είναι data dependent και ότι έχουμε 2 εβδομάδες με πολύ data και θα περιμένουμε να δούμε και αυτά και μετά θα κρίνουμε. Οπότε ναι, νομίζω ότι κάτι τέτοιο θα το αποφύγει, αλλά θα δούμε. Σιγά σιγά βλέπετε πως αυτό εδώ το chart το έχουμε δει να σταθεροποιείται και κυρίως στο 27 με 30% πιθανότητα την τελευταία εβδομάδα για τις 50. Νομίζω ότι σήμερα θα έχουμε κάποια διακύμανση εδώ, σίγουρα και με τα νέα, και ειδικά την επόμενη εβδομάδα που έχουμε για το CPI θα δούμε κάποια στη διακύμανση εδώ. Οπότε δεν έχουμε κάτι από το να περιμένουμε να δούμε το τι θα σχολιάσει. Για όσους επίσης είναι το πρώτο τέτοιο stream που παρακολουθούν, να ξέρετε ότι εγώ τα σημειώνω τις ερωτήσεις, σημειώνω τα σημαντικά στοιχεία. Δεν μιλάω συνήθως πάνω στην ομιλία, την αφήνω να τρέχει και μετά σχολιάζω στο κλείσιμο της ομιλίας ό,τι έχει πει. Οπότε το πρώτο και το βασικό θα σας ρωτήσω και μετά είναι να δούμε τους ήχους και το αν η ήχη είναι εντάξει όταν με το καλό ανοίξει η ομιλία. Πριν από λίγο κιόλας είδαμε και το BTC να κάνει ένα μικρό drop, αλλά είδαμε και τον S&P να κάνει ένα αντίστοιχο μικρό. Γενικά είναι απίστευτο πόσο stable είναι αυτή τη στιγμή, το έχει καταντήσει το bitcoin. Το outlook μου το έχω πει και στα παιδιά στο Discord, θα δούμε τώρα το τι θα γίνει από εδώ και πέρα, το τι θα περίμενα. Γενικά επίσης θα περίμενα το ευρώ να συνεχίσει την πτωτική του πορεία, τουλάχιστον στη New York Session, να πάρει αυτό, αν όχι και αυτά εδώ τα lows. Οπότε από αυτό το πρίσμα θα περιμέναμε bullish νέα από τον Powell και να συνέχιζε ίσως την πτωτική του τάση. Αυτή είναι εδώ την σημερινή πτωτική τάση. Αλλά ναι, παιδιά, η ώρα είναι 5 παρά μερικά δευτερόλεπτα, οπότε θα ξεκινήσει και η ομιλία όσον ούπο. Καλησπέρα και σε όσους έχουν μπει τώρα, καλώς ήρθατε στο stream. Sorry αν δεν έχω χαιρετήσει κάποιον προσωπικά. Μπούλη συμπέρυση ομιλία, παιδιά, δεν έχουμε ιδέα. Δεν μπορώ να πω κάτι, δεν θέλω να πάρω τέτοια θέση. Θεωρώ ότι θα πει πάρα πολύ για την ιδέα του data dependent γενικά. Θα πει κλασικό, είμαστε σε καλό δρόμο, έχουμε δει την πρόοδο, μπουρου, αλλά είμαστε πολύ data dependent και ειδικά για αυτό το μήνα και ό,τι είναι νέο ρε παιδί μου θα σας το πούμε μέσα στο επόμενο SCP, γιατί μην ξεχνάτε ότι σε 15 μέρες παίρνουμε, που είναι το meeting της Fed, παίρνουμε και καινούριο Summer of Economic Projections, οπότε θα έχουμε και νέα από την άποψη ότι θα δούμε το υπόλοιπο κομμάτι, θα δούμε το outlook το οποίο θέλουν για το 2023-2024 σε καλύτερη εικόνα. Αυτό. Οπότε να περιμένουμε λίγο. Εσείς τι πιστεύετε, για πάμε για να βάλουμε ένα poll. Να δούμε. Εσείς τι πιστεύετε. Το έχω βάλει παιδιά το poll, οπότε άμα θέλετε ψηφίζετε. Κιόλας βοηθάει. Αν καλό θα ήταν να μην πεις τώρα για trade, γιατί θα έχει μεγάλο volatility. Αν μιλάς ότι εγώ είμαι μπορείς, πού είσαι Γιάννο, καλησπέρα. Ότι εγώ είμαι μπορείς, είπα δεν ξέρω. Αν κρίνω καθαρά από το διάγραμμα του ευρωδόλαρου, ναι, θα περίμενα ότι θα ήταν πιο δοτικό αυτή η ιδέα που θα είχα. Επίσης το BTC αρχίζει να τρέχει αυτά τα lows. Ωραία, οπότε βγάλτε αυτό. Το ευρωδόλαρο το πήρε όλα αυτά εδώ, τα τρομερό κεράκι στις 5. Οπότε το πλάνο που είπα πριν από 1,5 λεπτό βγήκε. Ότι θα περίμενα στο New York Session να πάμε να τα πάρουμε αυτά. Οκ. Δεν ξέρω τι έγινε και είχαμε αυτόν τον τρόπο εδώ. Μπορεί να είχε κάποια σχέση. Δεν έχουμε νέα σήμερα. Κάτι άλλο, κάποιο νούμερο το οποίο να περιμένουμε. Στις 5. Όχι. Δώστε μου ένα λεπτό. Να δω τι γίνεται. Δεν έχει ανοίξει. Ναι, τώρα ξεκινάει σιγά σιγά η ομιλία από ό,τι βλέπω. Οπότε πιστεύω ότι τώρα θα μας ανοίξουν εδώ. Πιστεύω τώρα θα ανοίξουν εδώ. Λοιπόν... πιστεύω η αγορά είναι απλά σε μια διόρθωση. Τι ώρα μιλάει? Μιλάει στις 5, θα πρέπει να έχει ανοίξει πριν 3 λεπτά, αλλά εντάξει τώρα αυτό έχει μικροκαθυστερήσεις, τέτοια πραγματάκια. Τι ακριβώς είναι τα επιτόκια με απλά ελληνικά, έχω μπερδευτεί λίγο. Δημήτρη, θα σου πω ότι έχω κάνει ένα πολύ αναλυτικό βίντεο στο κανάλι μου. Θα σου στείλω και το link τώρα, μόλις άνοιξε και ο Powell. Έχω κάνει ένα βίντεο στο οποίο μιλάω για το ακριβώς τι είναι τα επιτόκια. Σας παρακαλώ πείτε μου μία αν ακούτε καλά ή το οτιδήποτε. Λοιπόν, έχω στείλει το link στο chat που εξηγώ ακριβώς το τι είναι τα επιτόκια στο βίντεο. Όποιος θέλει μπορεί να το δει και δεν έχει ιδέα.
Prices are still too high across many parts of the economy. We know that who feels it the most when the cost of rent and groceries go up. It's not the economic
Τέλεια, οπότε ακούτε καλά.
Who lecture us about
Άρα,
discipline and
είμαστε μια
stability. It's
χαρά
not the
εδώ.
corporate executives who pretend they're making tough choices about prices while reporting record profit increases quarter after quarter and doing more and more stock buybacks. It's the people working hourly jobs to make ends meet. It's seniors on fixed income and Social Security. It's everyone who gets their income from a paycheck each month, not an investment portfolio. It's those same Americans who stand to lose the most if the Fed's actions to curb inflation go too far. No matter what goes wrong in our economy, a global pandemic, a war in Eastern Europe, weather disasters, profits somehow always manage to go up. Workers are left paying the price. As you've noted, Chair Powell, the Fed's tools are only one element in our fight against inflation. It's a complex problem. Interest rates are a single, we know, blunt tool. Raising interest rates can't rebuild our supply chains and fix demand imbalances from the pandemic. Raising interest rates won't end Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Raising interest rates won't prevent avian flu from devastating 1/3 of our egg supply or weather disasters from destroying key crops. And raising interest rates certainly won't stop big corporations from exploiting all of these crises to jack up prices far beyond the increase in their costs. Last year, corporate profits hit a record high. Corporate PR chiefs assure us that these companies just have to raise prices. Their costs are going up. The workers just want to be paid too much. They have no other choice, they tell us. Yet when you look at their profits and their executive salaries and their stock buyback plans, it sure doesn't look like corporations have exhausted every available alternative. It's so brazen, even global bankers called on the Fed to identify this profiteering as one of the biggest drivers of inflation. Paul Donovan, chief economist of global wealth management at UBS, wrote, "The Fed should make clear that raising profit margins are spurring inflation. Companies have passed higher costs on to consumers, but they've also taken advantage of circumstances to expand profit margins. The broadening of inflation beyond commodity prices is more profit margin expansion than wage cost pressures. Think about that. From a chief economist at UBS, I'll say it again, they've taken advantage. These companies have taken advantage of circumstances to expand profit margins. The broadening of inflation beyond commodity prices is more profit margin expansion than wage cost pressures, unquote. The Fed, understandably, the Fed can't force corporations to change their ways or rewrite the Wall Street business model on its own. But the Fed can talk about it. High interest rates, falling wages, increasing unemployment are all hallmarks of failed policies that end up helping Wall Street, the largest corporation.
Επειδή κάνει εισαγωγή έτσι κι αλλιώς, μάγκες, ψηφίστε και μια στο chat το αν είστε πολύ συμπέρις για τη συγκεκριμένη ομιλία. Και δεύτερον, πριν ξεκινήσουμε, μην ξεχάσετε να κάνετε και ένα like στο stream. Ξέρετε ότι βοηθάνε πάρα πολύ. Ευχαριστώ κιόλας που είστε και τόσο άτομα μέσα να δούμε παρέα την ομιλία.
We've seen encouraging trends. That isn't happening. And there are other ways we can bring prices down instead of lowering demand. Again, making people poorer, laying people off, denying worker raises. We can speed up and strengthen our supply chains. We can bring critical manufacturing back to the U.S. We can rebuild our infrastructure. It's what we're doing with the CHIPS Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. For the first time in decades, we're finally recognizing the damage that I and many of my colleagues warned the corporate offshoring would do to our economy. Look at East Palestine, Ohio, a community that Senator Vance and I have visited a number of times recently. America learned about this small town last month.
Παιδιά, βρήκαμε γιατί νομίζω πέσανε εκείνη τη στιγμή στις 5. Πρέπει να έχει και κάποιο είδους άρθρο και κάποιο testimony το οποίο έκανε ο Powell, ενώ πριν την ομιλία, κάποιο έγγραφη μορφή, ρε παιδί μου. Και το έβγαλε μόλις τώρα άρθρο ο φίλος μας ο Νίκτη και λέει Jerome Powell to testify on Congress. Το είχαν και πριν αυτό το άρθρο, το είχα διαβάσει, αλλά τώρα λέει ότι ο Powell είπε new data suggests the ultimate level of rates is likely to be higher than previously anticipated, το οποίο σημαίνει ότι ακόμα περισσότερες αυξήσεις, και νομίζω ότι περισσότερο ότι αυτό if the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we would prepare to increase the pace of rate hikes. Οπότε εδώ βλέπουμε ένα πολύ καθαρό flip-flop από τη Fed, το οποίο πριν τι έλεγε ότι εμείς από τη στιγμή που πήγαμε στις 25 δεν θα ξαναγυρίσουμε στις 50, και τώρα λένε ότι αν και τα δεδομένα αυτού του μήνα είναι κακά, τότε επιστρέφουμε στις 50 μονάδες βάσης. Οπότε τώρα υποθέτω ότι η αγορά το έχει κάνει, αρχίζει να το κάνει και αυτό pricing, οπότε υποθέτω ότι αυτό εδώ μέσα στις επόμενες ώρες θα το δούμε να αυξάνεται, υποθέτω, και θα δούμε σίγουρα και την ομιλία του Powell, να δούμε για το τι θα πει. Αλλά γι' αυτό νομίζω είδαμε αυτό το πολύ απότομο drop. Μάτωσε. Όνα σου μάτωσε. Και ματώνει και το BTC.
Finally starting to get a little power in this economy. Unemployment's at a historic low, 3.4%. That's not just a number. That means Americans have more opportunities, more options, even in places that haven't seen a lot in recent years. It means people have the power to demand raises and retirement security and paid sick days and some control over their schedules. It means more Americans have the dignity that comes with a good job that provides for your family. We must here ensure that all Americans have the opportunity for that dignity of work. It's a critical time. The consequences of missteps could be severe. Mr. Chairman, two more things that affect your job. It's not just monetary policy that threatens American pocketbooks. Some of my colleagues have threatened the nation's full faith and credit by holding the debt ceiling hostage for partisan politics. Instead of paying our bills on time, they're essentially threatening all Americans. The Fifth Circuit's Consumer Financial Protection Bureau ruling could also cause unimaginable instability and chaos for families, for consumers, but also, as the chair knows, for a financial system. The Fifth Circuit is Wall Street's, no doubt about it, the Fifth Circuit is Wall Street's favorite courthouse. It recently ruled the CFPB's independent funding is unconstitutional. If the Supreme Court upholds the Fifth Circuit's ruling, It will not only devastate CFPB, it will threaten the independent funding of many other federal agencies, including the Federal Reserve. I look forward to today's hearing, how the Fed will balance its dual mandate and continue to promote an economy where everyone who wants a good job can find one, an economy that works for everyone. Senator Scott. Sorry.
Fine. Good morning, Jerome Powell. Sitting here, looking at my prepared remarks, thinking about, there's an opening coming where Vice Chairman Brainer's moving on. I think it's really important for us to make sure that all the information that we need in order to make a good decision on the next nom that we have in a timely fashion. So I would really implore the chair to make sure that happens. That every question, every questionnaire that is asked from the person, we get. Every member of this committee has their questions answered in a timely fashion, and that the staff has their answers in a timely fashion. Listening to Chairman Brown, I thought to myself, fascinating, truly fascinating. I concluded that, well, I know Chairman Brown pretty well. I am sure he is sincere in his rant. But let me just say this. Spending and printing trillions of dollars, caving to the radical left in this country, seeing policies posited and then implemented that led to the worst inflation in 40 years, seeing our inflation at 9.1%, seeing American families struggle because of the weight of the government on their shoulders, seeing the devastation from South Carolina to Ohio. It's unbelievable that the progressives in this country who caused a 9.1% inflation would then turn somewhere besides in the mirror to see the absolute devastation caused by their out-of-control spending is remarkable. Remarkable. To stop the out-of-control inflation caused by the out-of-control spending, the Fed steps in to cool the economy. Well, the definition of cooling the economy is necessary because we've seen the most radical approach to a problem that was in our rearview mirror being used as a Trojan horse to bring in a level of socialism and spending that our nation has not seen in my lifetime. The facts are very simple. When you get to 9.1% inflation in this nation, as a kid who grew up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, a 40% today, 100% just a year ago increase in the gas prices devastates single mothers around this country. For seniors on fixed income whose savings are being depleted with an average cost just last month of a $433 increase because of inflation. For my friends on the other side of the aisle to look any place besides a mirror, I find stunning. The truth is that when your food prices go up over 20%, when your electricity is up over 20%, you have to ask yourself, where in the world are they? They cannot be in this universe. It must be an alternate universe where, in fact, it's okay for us to see prices go through the roof and our economy not stumble, but fall into a ditch. Why are we in the ditch? Because progressives used the pandemic as a way to usher in a form of spending that takes the money out of the pockets of everyday Americans and puts it in the coffers of the government. There is a better way. The better way is to trust the American people. And when you do so, we don't have to have the Fed come in
Λαϊκισμό στο 800%
so high to quell the challenges in our economy so that today versus 18 months ago, the price of the same house for your mortgage payment is twice as high. Why? Because of the runaway spending of our friends on the other side of the aisle. I'm sure I do not have time for my opening comments, but I will say without any question, as I look around the country and I ask myself, how devastating is it that today it costs $433 more than it did a year ago? The answer is it is a crisis. When the average family in our country just a couple of years ago didn't have $400 in their savings for an emergency, to have prices go up by this amount, it's devastating. To have a conversation about rents around the country, looking at the inflationary effect and the absolute devastation of a snarling supply chain that we haven't seen in my lifetime, run by my friends in the progressives. Unbelievable. But to get to you, Chairman Powell. One of the comments that you've made that I think is really important in one of the speeches that you gave in January, and I apologize for my rant. I just wanted to make sure my rant was consistent with my friend here. It is essential, you said, that we stick to our statutory goals and authorities, and that we resist the temptation to broaden our scope to address other important social issues of the day. Taking on new goals, however worthy, without a clear statutory mandate would undermine the case of our independence. You further noted that, and I quote, without explicit congressional legislation, it would be inappropriate for us to use our monetary policy or supervisory tools to promote a greener economy or to achieve other climate-based goals. We are not and will not be a climate policy maker. Do you still stand by those comments?
I do.
Thank you. Finally, I know we're not in the question. I know, I get it. Finally.
Finally.
Yes, I knew the chairman would dock that from my time, and I appreciate you doing so.
Ναι, τρως κι άλλο χρόνο, πάμε, έλα.
Finally, several of my Republican colleagues and I sent a letter to you discussing Vice Chair of Supervision Michael Barr's plan to conduct a holistic review of capital standards. I look forward to discussing those capital standards during my Q&A, and I will thank you for our recent conversation that we had that helped illuminate some of the necessary challenges that we face as a nation and your answers to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Speaking of illuminating, thank you, Senator Scott.
Yes, sir.
Άρα ο τύπος πήρε τόση ώρα για να πει...
Today we'll hear from Chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, on monetary policy.
Για να λαϊκίσει σε έναν βαθμό.
I expect Chair Powell to weigh in on the mini debate we just had, but I think we all know that the debt increase was much larger under
δεν είστε για green energy. Υπεύθυνοι. Και του λέει ναι.
Chair Powell, thank you for your service and your testimony today.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and other members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation is causing significant hardship, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal. Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We have covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Our policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. I'll review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. The data from January on employment, consumer spending, manufacturing production, and inflation have partly reversed the softening trends that we'd seen in the data just a month ago. Some of this reversal likely reflects the unseasonably warm weather in January in much of the country. Still, the breadth of the reversal, along with revisions to the previous quarter, suggests that inflationary pressures are running higher than expected at the time of our previous FOMC meeting. From a broader perspective, inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year, but remains well above the FOMC's longer-run objective of 2%. The 12-month change in total PCE inflation has slowed from its peak of 7% in June to 5.4% in January, as energy prices have declined and supply chain bottlenecks have eased. Over the past 12 months, core PCE inflation, which excludes the volatile food and energy prices, was 4.7%. As supply chain bottlenecks have eased and tighter policy has restrained demand, inflation in the core goods sector has fallen. And while housing services inflation remains too high, the flattening out in rents evident in recently signed leases points to a deceleration in this component of inflation over the year ahead. That said, there's little sign of disinflation thus far in the category of core services excluding housing, a category that accounts for more than half of core consumer expenditures. To restore price stability, we'll need to see lower inflation in this sector, and there will very likely be some softening in the labor market conditions. Although nominal wage gains have slowed somewhat in recent months, they remain above what is consistent with 2% inflation and current trends in productivity. Strong wage growth is good for workers, but only if it's not eroded by inflation. Turning to growth, the U.S. economy has slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 0.9%. Although consumer spending appears to be expanding at a solid pace this quarter, other recent indicators point to subdued growth of spending and production. Activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight. The unemployment rate was 3.4% in January, its lowest level since 1969. Job gains remained very strong in January, while the supply of labor has continued to lag. As of the end of December, there were 1.9 job openings for each unemployed individual, close to the all-time peak recorded last March, while unemployment insurance claims have remained near historical lows. Turning to monetary policy. With inflation well above our longer-run goal of 2%, and with the labor market remaining extremely tight, the FOMC has continued to tighten the stance of monetary policy, raising interest rates by 4.5 percentage points over the past year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. We are seeing the effects of our policy actions on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee slowed the pace of interest rate increases over its past 2 meetings. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. Although inflation has been moderating in recent months, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy. As I mentioned, the latest economic data have come in stronger than expected, which suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously anticipated. If the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes. Restoring price stability will likely require a restrictive stance of monetary policy for some time. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission, At the Federal Reserve, we will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are 23 of us on this committee. Almost everyone will be here today. I ask each of us to stay as close to the 5-minute mark as we can because we have votes at 11:30. So thank you all for your cooperation. Chair Powell, thank you. Job growth is strong as unemployment remains historically low. You might not know that from the opening statements. Many drivers of inflation, corporate greed, rising inequality, supply chain disruptions, Russia's bestiality, if you will, in Ukraine, won't get better because of interest rate increases. Every indication is that this post-pandemic economy is different. Should we be worried, Mr. Chair, that the Fed is treating this economic period as it has in the past instead of reacting differently?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've been aware since the very beginning and have discussed this publicly on many occasions that there are some differences this time. We
This time is different.
have not seen the kind of supply side collapse that we saw at the very beginning of the inflation outbreak. Also, the outbreak of a war, which had significant effects on commodity prices a year ago. So all that is different. There are also, though, some similarities. There is a mismatch between supply and demand. You can see that in the goods sector still. You saw it in housing prices going up over 40% since before the pandemic, and you see it in the labor market where we have 1.9 job openings for every opening, for every unemployed person. So we're well aware that this particular situation involves a mix of cycles of forces, not all of which our tools can affect, but there is a job here for us to do in better aligning demand with supply.
Okay, understanding you have limited tools to address inflation, and our conversations in the past show my concern about continued rate increases that may not actually address the root cause of inflation. They hurt workers, and many of us contend we can't follow the same old playbook. Next question. Last year, 3 banking regulators issued proposed updates on the Community Reinvestment Act to account for changes in our banking system. My question is, does the Fed remain committed to work with FDIC and OCC to finalize a CRA rule, and when will that rule likely be finalized?
Yes, we do remain committed, and I believe we are in broad agreement with the other 2 agencies on
Νομίζω
the
έκανε
to the rule. So now we're in the
ένα από τα
process
πιο,
of writing all that down, and
να το πω έτσι, ειλικρινή σχόλια για το βασικό πρόβλημα το οποίο επικρατεί αυτή τη στιγμή, το οποίο έχει γίνει εδώ και πολύ καιρό. Θα το αναφέρω.
I can't give you an exact date,
But as quickly as possible.
Yes, but it will be some months.
Okay, thank you. Banks weathered the shock of the COVID-19 shutdowns mostly because of the fiscal response provided by Congress. We now see a spike in loan delinquencies, an increase in overall risk. Banks are again plowing billions, as many other corporate leaders, always defended by people on that side of the aisle, into stock buybacks, which makes me concerned that there's a downturn in the economy. Banks could end up with too little capital. That's why I'm worried about any potential rollbacks of safeguards or regulations. Can you assure me that the Fed will keep capital requirements strong and exercise more long-term forward thinking than corporate CEOs that seem to be focused on the short term?
I can assure you as to the first part that we'll keep capital requirements strong.
Άμα θέλουμε θα εκτυπώσουμε χρήμα.
Give me an opinion about you're looking more forward than companies that look at the short-term benefits of stock buybacks. Mr. Chair, when you last testified, I asked you about the risk posed by crypto assets, stablecoin, the Fed, and other regulated possibilities. How is the Fed evaluating the risks of crypto-related activities by your supervised institutions?
So this is something we've been quite active in this area, and I'll say that we believe that innovation is very important over time to the economy. We don't want to stifle innovation. We don't want regulation to stifle innovation in a way that just favors incumbents and that kind of thing. But like everyone else, we're watching what's been happening in the crypto space, and what we see is quite a lot of turmoil. We see fraud. We see a lack of transparency. We see run risk. Lots and lots of things like that. And so what we've been doing is making sure that the regulated financial institutions that we supervise and regulate are careful, are taking great care in the ways that they engage with the whole crypto space, and that they give us prior notice. And we've issued, along with the FDIC and the OCC, a number of issuances of notices to that effect.
Thank you, and I will close with this. I've long pushed for the Fed to prioritize workers and for the leaders of the Fed
Δεν είπα
to
κάτι ιδιαίτερο για τα
reflect the
κρύπτο.
diversity of our country. We've made
Οκ.
progress.
Προσπαθούμε να...
We have a new opening.
Τίποτα,
Understand?
Klein.
It's not your job to appoint the new Fed member. We have a number of upcoming vacancies at the reserve banks. I support Senator Reid from Rhode Island, Senator Menendez from New Jersey, and other colleagues who are pushing for more diverse voices at the Fed. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, the chairman and I both have strong passions about the challenges that we face as a country. The one thing that I do believe that we agree on is the importance of having a strong capital markets as it relates to making sure that Americans have the ability to continue to grow their businesses and to solve their challenges. And frankly, I hope that we get there. Building on the same comment that the chairman had around capital standards is where I'm going to go with my thoughts today. When I think back on these last few years, it's hard not to recognize the extraordinary efforts our financial institutions of all sizes, frankly, undertook to administer a program like the PPP, all while weathering a shutdown of our global economy. I welcome your thoughts, but from my viewpoint, our banking system was resilient. Our financial institutions stepped up and delivered aid to support families and businesses every single day. That's why Vice Chair Barr's broad comments around holistic review of our capital trouble me so much. We should be laser focused on our economy and addressing the needs of everyday Americans trying to forge a new future and helping them open the door to opportunity. As you and I both know,
Δεν είπα κάτι για τα
capital
stablecoins
and its
ιδιαίτερα.
quality
Είπα,
must be continually
θα το σχολιάσω και μετά
scrutinized. But
μην...
increased capital does not necessarily provide an increased benefit, and requiring banks to hold capital that is not risk-based and appropriately tailored to a bank's size, scope, and activities can cause more harm than good. At a time of record inflation, where everyday needs are more expensive, we should not be pursuing actions that are harmful. Rather, we should be supporting the engine of our economy, small businesses. While I remain greatly concerned by the Vice Chair's comments, I am hopeful that you will ensure this review is appropriate, keeping the impacts on our banking system front and center. We must promote and further the growth of our economy and thereby our people. Anything less should be unacceptable. To that end, will you commit that any ongoing capital review by the Federal Reserve will follow the law and that any follow-on regulatory proposals will be risk-based and tailored to an institution's activity, size, and complexity, and not a one-size-fits-all?
Yes, I can easily commit to that. We're very strongly committed to tailoring, and that'll be, I can say that anything we do will reflect tailoring, which is a long-held principle for us.
Προς το παρόν δεν έχουν πει κάτι ιδιαίτερα μπέρις. Δηλαδή πέρα από το σχόλιο το οποίο έκανε αρχικά ο Powell, που το ακούσαμε και εδώ, δεν έχει πει κάτι ιδιαίτερο μπέρις ούτε ιδιαίτερα μπούλης.
Much like Congress designed the SEC to protect investors, to maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation, and not to advance progressive climate change policies, Congress designed the Federal Reserve to promote price stability and maximum employment, not to play politics. To that end, I find worrying the Fed's announcement of recent actions to consider climate-related scenarios, coupled with remarks by the Vice Chair of Supervision, as attempts to incorporate broader ESG policies into the financial services system. Banks have and continue to account for weather-related risks in their risk management, but efforts that attempt to predict climate change far into the future fall outside the scope of their authority. Importantly, the level of speculation required in these models should highlight their arbitrary and capricious nature. At a time when our economy is suffering from historically high inflation, I expect our central bank to focus its time and resources on bringing inflation down, not on policy outside of its mandate. I noted in my opening statement a recent speech that you've given about the state of the Fed and how you should resist the temptation to broaden its scope and to address social issues. Do you agree that the Federal Reserve does not have the authority or statutory direction to use its monetary policy or supervisory tools to wade into the ESG or other climate policies?
I do. As you know, there's a tightly focused role that we do have that I believe that we have, but I would agree with your statement.
Mr. Chairman, I have 20 seconds left, but I'm going to defer because of my earlier question to my opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Menendez is close, but not here yet. So, Senator Rounds. So, but nice try.
Yes, sir. Just want to make sure whatever you say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, welcome. It's always good to have you in front of our committee. As you know, both core and headline inflation have remained persistently elevated. And over the past 12 months, real average hourly earnings fell by 1.8%, about 4% since President Biden took office. To make ends meet as prices increase, more Americans are leaning on credit cards. At the end of 2022, credit card debt hit a record of $930.6 billion, an 18.5% spike from a year earlier, and an average credit card balance rose to $5,805. Over the past year, the Fed has acted aggressively to tame inflation, and yet we are still seeing price increases. And as we've discussed this several times, but I recognize that it's been an ongoing discussion, but I believe that this further proves that we have long been feeling the effects of a policy-induced inflation resulting from decisions by the Biden administration, primarily cutting off the resources necessary to improve and increase domestic energy production. I continue to be concerned that if you attempt to use the tools that are available at this time for the Fed, then I believe that we're going to have a challenge of not being able to address specifically the challenges brought out when you have a policy is promoting higher prices with regard to energy, as opposed to what you're trying to do, which is to bring down the total overall cost. And I just wanted to ask, I guess, and you're going to think this is something that we've heard before, but do you believe that you currently have the monetary policy tools to actually reduce inflation? And I just put it in this perspective. In January of 2021, the CPI was 1.4% when the Biden administration began. In January of 2022, and this is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, CPI was at 7.5%, 7.5%. Today, March of 2022, CPI is 8.5%. Wouldn't it be fair to assess that a lot of the policy or the inflation that we've seen here may very well be due to policy decisions by this administration?
Senator, not for us to point fingers. Our job is to use our tools. You asked whether we have the tools to get this job done, and we do. Over time, there are some things that we can't affect, but over time we can achieve 2% inflation, and we will.
In other words, you've got a limited number of tools available to you, and the limited number of tools that you have are designed to impact simply the reduction in prices and so forth, and yet if there are competing interests out there that are pushing prices higher, you don't have the wherewithal to decide one tool versus another based on whether it's policy-induced or whether it is a matter of a shortage in supplies from outside or whether it's war-related.
That's right. Our tools essentially work on demand, moderating demand, and so that's what we can do.
So if there were policies in place that actually help to reduce inflation, in other words, and by that, I'm just going to look at energy alone just as a good example. If policies were in place that were actually allowing energy prices to come down in the United States, then you would have less of a need to use the very blunt tools that you do have right now with regard to increasing rate increases.
Την έχουν κατακράξει την κυβέρνηση Biden.
In a sense it is, but I would just say on energy
I'm not trying to get you to a policy discussion with what the president's doing on his energy policy. I just want to make it clear that you have to respond to what's in front of you, and it doesn't matter where the inflation is coming from or what's driving it up. You're simply trying to bring it back down to that 2% number with the only tools that you've really got.
Yes, but I will say on energy, energy has tended over time to fluctuate up and down, and it's not mainly affected by our tools. So The things we look at are really things that are tightly linked to demand in the U.S. economy. Those we can affect.
And I think just the fact that you've been increasing interest rates, and yet inflation continues to ride up, would suggest, just as you've just indicated, that when you have high energy prices, it's tough to impact that part of it with the monetary policy that you've got available to you.
So we focus on everything, but we also focus on core in particular, which doesn't include energy prices. And what's happened is core inflation has come down, but nowhere near as fast as we might have hoped, and it has a long way to go.
Thank you. One last question. Last June, Vice Chairman of Supervision Michael Barr testified before this committee that he would defend the use of the aggregation method as an alternative approach to the insurance capital standards, the ICS, proposed by the IAIS. As the final compatibility criteria set to come out later this year, can you confirm that you share Vice Chair Barr's views on this AM?
I will confirm that, but I'll have to get back to you on the status of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Round. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to take this moment to remind my colleagues that there are more than 62 million Latinos that call the United States home. We are the largest.
Το που είπα ότι δεν ισχύει είναι αυτό που είπε για το κομμάτι του core CPI. Σας το ξαναπεί ότι ναι, μεν το core CPI βγάζει τους πολύ πολύ καθαρούς παράγοντες ενέργειας, αλλά ακόμα και το να πας σε ένα ταξίδι με ένα αεροπλάνο που πιάνεται στο core CPI ή τα παράγωγα του πετρελαίου, τα οποία είναι άπειρα, πλαστικά, το οτιδήποτε, πιάνονται στο core CPI, το οποίο σημαίνει ότι σε έναν βαθμό οι τιμές της ενέργειας επηρεάζουν το core CPI, αλλά το έχουμε ξαναπεί αυτό που είπε ο Πάολ και καλά, ότι είναι εντελώς αντίθετα, δεν ισχύει.
And in practice, that means that the voices of nearly 1/5 of our country's people are repeatedly drowned out when the Fed is making critical decisions on economic policy. Decisions that affect whether a Latino family can afford their first home, find a job that pays a living wage, send their children to college, save for a comfortable retirement, or get a loan to expand their business. Right now, the Biden administration has a clear opportunity to make history with its next nomination to the Board of Governors. It has identified a number of highly qualified Latino candidates who have dedicated their careers to the fields of economics, who are committed to the Fed's dual mandate, who will preserve the independence of the central bank. The administration has rightly nominated and advocated for a number of diverse candidates with similar qualifications, both at the Fed and elsewhere. But despite having 5 opportunities over the past 2 years to nominate a qualified Latino economist to serve at the Federal Reserve, this administration has repeatedly chosen not to. Representation, or lack thereof, does not happen by accident. It is a choice, and I hope the administration makes the right choice with this nomination. Mr. Chairman, would you say that it is a truism that the United States dollar is the reserve of choice in the world?
Yes, I would.
And that brings us enormous benefits, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Now, 12 years ago, a Republican House brought us to the brink of defaulting on the debt for the first time in history of this country, jeopardizing our credit and the world economy. I'm getting a sense of deja vu because, once again, Republicans are recklessly demanding draconian spending cuts to programs that hardworking U.S. families rely on in exchange for allowing the Treasury Department to pay for spending that Congress, including most of them, have already voted to authorize. If you want to talk about spending cuts, it seems to me that the budget is the time to do that, but not to put the full faith and credit of the United States at risk. Chairman Powell, can you talk about the catastrophic damage a debt default would inflict on the economy?
So I guess I will start.
Το debt default είναι εάν δεν μπορεί να πληρώσει Αμερική τα χρέη της.
Between the executive branch and Congress, we do not seek to play a role in these policy issues. But at the end of the day, there's only one solution to this problem, and that is Congress. Whatever else may happen will happen, but Congress really needs to raise the debt ceiling. That's the only way out, in a timely way that allows us to pay all of our bills when and as due. And if we fail to do so, I think that the consequences are hard to estimate, but they could be extraordinarily adverse, and could do long-standing harm.
Well, I think that's a mild statement of what would happen. I understand I didn't ask you to engage in the congressional executive branch roles. I asked you about the abstract question of what happens if you have a debt default. Isn't even this constant fight putting into question the possibility that the United States will not honor its full faith and credit have consequences within the economy?
In principle, it could. I think markets tend and observers tend to watch this and tend to think that it will work out, and it has in the past worked out. So it needs to work out this time too.
Now, seeing your testimony before the committee, is it fair to say that you'll do whatever is necessary to tame inflation?
We serve a dual mandate, and we will do what we can, everything we can to restore price stability while also serving maximum employment.
And primarily that means additional rate increases, would it not? What other tool do you have?
That's what we have. The balance sheet, the shrinkage of the balance sheet will continue too, but it's principally rate hikes.
So the question is, when does that part of doing anything necessary to tame inflation come into conflict with your other mandate of maximum employment?
Not now, when we have the lowest unemployment in 54 years, and where we have a labor market that is extremely tight, extremely. So, but that time could come, but it really isn't now, where we're very far from our price stability mandate, and in effect, the economy is past most estimates of maximum employment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you for being here.
Νάτος, Θεός, ο καλύτερος είναι αυτός.
You and your team for helping to save the economy during the pandemic meltdown. For what it's worth, I'm generally supportive of the actions of the Fed right now, and I'm not going to ask you today to blame anybody. When Congress spends money, it stimulates the economy, does it not?
Well, it would depend on whether that's funded by tax increases or not. But so, if there's a spending that's not accompanied by taxes, would have a net at the margin stimulative effect.
Well, and when Congress borrows money to spend even more, that stimulates the economy even more, does it not?
At the margin, yeah.
Okay. If Congress reduced the rate of growth in its spending and reduced the rate of growth in its debt accumulation, it would make your job easier in reducing inflation, would it not?
I don't think fiscal policy right now is a big factor driving inflation at this moment, but it's absolutely essential that we do slow the pace of growth, particularly for the areas of the budget.
All right, let's try to unpack this then. I'm not trying to trick you. You're raising interest rates. You're raising interest rates to slow the economy, are you not?
Yes, to cool the economy off.
And one of the ways you measure your success, other than fluctuation in gross domestic product, is the unemployment rate. Is it not?
Yes, one of the measures.
Okay. So in effect, I'm not being critical. When you're slowing the economy, you're trying to put people out of work. That's your job, is it not?
Not really. We're trying to restore price stability.
No, you're trying to raise
not wages.
You're trying to raise the unemployment rate. That means I know you don't like the phrase, so let me strike it. You're trying to raise the unemployment rate, are you not?
No, we're not trying to raise it. We're trying to realign supply and demand, which could happen through a bunch of channels, like, for example, just job openings.
All right, let me put it another way, okay? The Economist did a wonderful study. They looked at 10 disinflationary periods in America going all the way back to the 1950s. Disinflation is what you're trying to do. It's a slowing in the rate of inflation. Am I right?
Yes.
In other words, prices don't go down, they just don't go up as fast. Deflation is when prices actually go down. You're trying to achieve disinflation, are you not?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Based on history, in the 10 times that we got inflation down, disinflation, since the 1950s. In order to reduce inflation by 2%, unemployment had to go up 3.6%. Now, that's history, is it not?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yes, the standard has been that there have been recessions and downturns when the Fed has tried to reduce inflation.
Now, right now, the current inflation rate is 6.4%, and the current unemployment rate is 3.4%. Now, if history is right, I'm not asking you to again, blame anybody, but if history is right, unless you get some help, in order to get inflation down from 6.4% to, let's say, 4.4%, and the unemployment rate is going to have to rise to 7% based on history.
That's what the record would say.
Okay. And to get inflation down to 2.2% based on history, an immutable fact, unemployment would have to go to 10.6%. Would it not?
No, I wouldn't.
That's what the record shows. That's what the history shows.
Yeah, I don't think that kind of a number is at all in play here.
I know you're reluctant to admit it, and you don't want to get in the middle of a policy dispute. But I think it's undeniable. It's undeniable. The only way we're going to get this sticky inflation down is to attack it on the monetary side, which you're doing, and on the fiscal side, which means Congress has got to reduce the rate of growth of spending and reduce the rate of debt accumulation. Now, I get that you don't want to get in the middle of that fight. But the more we help on the fiscal side, the fewer people you're going to have to put out of work. Isn't that a fact?
Please answer.
It could work out that way.
Sir?
It could work out that way.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Senator Reid of Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here today. We saw in the wake of COVID the globalized supply chain disrupted significantly, and we're in the process, in some respects, of rebuilding a supply chain with an emphasis on sourcing in the United States. To what extent did that disruptive supply chain contribute to inflation, and to what extent will the new, if you envision it, the new supply chain that is located in the United States and other friendly countries affect inflation?
So the initial outbreak of inflation was all about spending on goods where people couldn't spend on services. So goods spending went way up, and the global supply chain, many goods are imported. The global supply chain just collapsed, and that was the source of the original inflation. It has now spread over the last 2 years to housing and also to the rest of the service sector. So to your question, we are seeing goods inflation has been coming down for some time now. It's still too high, but it's coming down. Housing services there's in the pipeline. You see the new leases that are being signed, and what that tells you is that in the next 6 to 12 months, we will see that come down. But this big service sector that's everything else, which is financial services, medical services, travel and leisure, all of those things, that's really where that's the source of the inflation we have now, which had nothing to do with the supply, or not much to do with the supply chains. That's where the challenge is now.
And is there anything that you can do that would target that service area without affecting the other areas?
There's not really. You know, our monetary policy tools are famously powerful but blunt.
A different topic, and that is, as you're probably aware, the Fifth Circuit delivered a ruling in the Community Financial Services Association versus CFPB that the CFPB's funding mechanism is unconstitutional. Just like the Board of Governors, the CFPB is a bureau of the Federal Reserve. Both the Board of Governors and the CFPB rely on the same source of funds and draw on those funds in virtually identical ways. If the Board of Governors funding structure would be found unconstitutional, what would the implications be for the country and monetary policy?
Well, it would be very significant, but I have to say we have significant responsibilities, but I would be reluctant to comment on a case that's before the Supreme Court.
But it is certainly something that you've had people examine for possible ramifications.
Yes, and the central banks tend to be self-funding because of the way they work, and that's a key factor of our independence.
We've going back and forth on the impact of rate hikes on workers, and you've indicated previously that wages
Για τα
not
wages.
spiraling upwards necessarily, and that inflation expectations are currently stable. But the impact on increased interest rates are usually felt more by low to moderate income people. Is there any way you can work yourself out of that dilemma?
So where we are right now, of course, is very low unemployment. Wages have been moderating, and they've been doing so without a softening in the labor market, without rising unemployment, really.
Sure.
And that's a good thing. So we really don't know. The current situation is a combination of more typical supply and demand issues, but also just things that we haven't seen before, like the war in Ukraine, like the supply chains that you mentioned.
Right.
So we have many unusual factors, and I don't think anybody knows with confidence how this is going to play out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Reid. Senator Brett, Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, it's great to have you here today. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the highest inflation of my lifetime, driving up costs for American families across the board. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, the annual inflation rate in 2021 was 7%, and in 2022, it was 6.5%. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the cost of food went up 10% in 2022. And the real effects of that is moms and dads across this nation that are working to put food on the table for their kids, for their babies, had a harder time doing that. This has devastated hardworking Americans, causing a kitchen table crisis in every corner of our country, as the price of food, energy, and housing have all skyrocketed. In response, the Federal Reserve has raised the Federal Reserve Fund rate more than 4 percentage points. Being far from transient, inflation has remained persistent, high, and well above the Fed's long-run goal of remaining under 2%. In the coming year, what factors and indicators are you paying attention to as you and the Federal Open Market Committee decide on whether to increase rates?
So I'd say a couple things to that. First, we're going to be looking at inflation in the 3 sectors that I mentioned: the goods sector, the housing sector, and then the broader service sector. And we need the inflation that's already underway in the goods sector to continue, and that's really important. In the housing sector, we just need the time to pass so that reported inflation comes down, and it's effectively in the pipeline as long as new leases are being signed at relatively small increases. So we'll be watching very, very carefully, though, at the larger service sector, which is 56% of consumer spending, and more than that of what's currently inflation. So that's one thing we'll be watching that very carefully. Also, we raised rates very quickly last year, and we know that monetary policy, tightening policy, has delayed effects. It takes a while for the full effects to be seen in economic activity and inflation. So we're watching carefully to see those effects come into play. So we're aware that we haven't seen the full effects yet, and we're taking that into account as we think about rate hikes.
So when you're looking at this, obviously not to get into a policy discussion, but if there were an increase of energy production in this country, do you feel like that would help drive down inflation?
Well, I think over time, more energy would mean lower energy prices. But we are very focused on what we call core inflation, because that is what is driven by, really by demand, and our tools are really aimed at demand.
Right, understood. But I feel like the cost of energy is not just what you pay at the pump; it ends up affecting every good across the situation.
Το λογικό, ρε
I'd like to ask you about labor participation. So when you look at the unemployment rate, and we've heard my colleagues discuss people having to be displaced in order for us to maybe get to the inflation rate that we would like as a nation, I'd like to focus on the labor participation rate. So right now it's 62.4%. If there were an increase in people coming back into the workforce, would that be a positive factor with regards to driving us down to the 2% rate that you want to achieve?
I think that it would. I mean, remember those people coming into jobs.
Yes.
That would be great because the economy clearly wants more people.
Με τα γυαλιά από πίσω σορτάρει.
Of course, those people would then spend more, so it wouldn't be a zero-sum game. But it would be great for the country and great for them if they were to come into the labor force.
Amen. I believe that increasing in capital requirements on financial institutions would have a chilling effect on the economy and the availability of financial services. And last week, I joined many of my colleagues in sending you a letter that expressed concerns that if the Federal Reserve decides to conduct a, quote, holistic review of capital standards, as we heard Senator Scott talk about earlier. So is the Federal Reserve concerned that the impact to the economy of increasing capital requirements on financial institutions at a time when inflation remains persistently high would cause an issue?
So I think it's always a balance. We know that higher capital makes banks safer and sounder. We also know that you will at the margin provide less credit the more capital you have to have. But I think it's never exactly clear that you're at the perfect equilibrium, and it's a fair question, I think, to look at that.
And I know out of respect for the chairman and trying to stay in my time, I will just end by saying I heard what you said. Obviously, as you have said, the Federal Reserve is not and will not be a climate policymaker. I just want to thank you for your public statement on that. I agree with you that there's a difference between policymakers and financial regulators, and certainly look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks, Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, it's good to see you again. Let me start by saying, depending on who's asking questions, we're either pounding you for how quickly we're going to drive that inflation back to 2%, or pounding you on making sure that we don't push the economy into a recession and drive up unemployment. I got to tell you, and these are maybe not the cheap seats, but I actually think you've done a pretty good job in terms of both ratcheting up rates and then starting to tail off a little bit. I think we all were concerned by the January numbers where it popped up a little bit more. I wish, Mr. Chairman, we were actually having this hearing 2 weeks from now because we're going to have a lot more data later in this week and next week. But I want to net. We've still got ways to go, and the January numbers were concerning. But I do think your tailored approach. We can all second guess, but I think it has been the right approach. And I'm going to commend you on that. I want to get two questions in. One of the areas that I am very worried about is commercial debt. I mean, we've got a Bloomberg story here showing we're going to hit a $6 trillion wall this year on refinancing. Where I'm particularly concerned is the issue around commercial real estate. As we recover from COVID, a lot of things are getting back to normal, but clearly the transformation of where people work is going through a fundamental transition, and I hope people do return more to the office, but lots of folks prefer working elsewhere. That's going to fundamentally change the real estate market on the commercial side, and I do believe we're going to hit potentially a cliff here of a totally unexpected problem in terms of commercial real estate. How are you looking at that issue and recognizing there's lots of bumps coming out of COVID? This one seems to be more unique in nature, and how are you thinking about that issue?
So the first one on commercial debt, business debt generally, it's kind of been moving sideways as a percent of GDP, so you don't see a big spike going on or anything like that. However, of course, there are pockets of concern, and particularly you pointed to the refinancing spike that has to happen, and I've seen those come and go before. Generally, markets can absorb them, maybe at a much higher rate this time, but it's something that we're well aware of and watching carefully. In terms of CRE, I would agree with you. The occupancy of office space in many major cities is just remarkably low, and you wonder how that can be. Now, over time, some of that's going to be made into condominiums and things like that, since we don't seem to have quite enough housing in some places. But the question is, what's the financial stability risk? It's not great for the largest institutions. Don't tend to have a lot of direct exposure to that. Some smaller banks actually do. Medium and small size banks do. We carefully monitor it. We agree that that's an area that requires a lot of monitoring. And, I'd say we're on the case. So.
Well, that will morph me into my last question, something we've talked about and a lot of my colleagues have talked about with the large institutions. I mean, I do think even some of the biggest critics of Dodd-Frank, I think, would acknowledge our banking system is a heck of a lot stronger and was able to withstand COVID in a very healthy way. But what we've also
seen, η ομιλία δεν είναι πολύ... Είναι ευχαριστηθεί πολύ, είναι αλήθεια. Ωραία ποιντάκια. Ωραία points, μιλάει για λίγο mortgage και τέτοια, οπότε δεν έχει ιδιαίτερη σημασία αυτή τη στιγμή. Έτσι για να κάνουμε λίγο ένα sum up μέχρι τώρα. Ξεκίνησε ο άλλος, και είπε ότι αρχικά έχετε καταλάβει ότι γενικά δεν είναι πολύ υπέρ της κυβέρνησης οι συγκεκριμένοι άνθρωποι που μιλάνε αυτή τη στιγμή, γι' αυτό έχουν πιέσει εισαγωγικά και λίγο τον Powell στο κομμάτι θεωρείται ότι φταίει η κυβέρνηση, θεωρείται ότι φταίει η κυβέρνηση, θεωρείται ότι φταίει η κυβέρνηση. Αυτό λοιπόν που είδαμε εδώ λίγο είναι και ότι ξεκίνησε λοιπόν η ομιλία και είπε ο πρώτος, ο chairman εκεί που μιλάει, λέει ότι ξέρουμε ότι τα επιτόκια είναι μια λύση η οποία προσφέρεται.
Same activity, same regulation. And that's...
Μια λύση η οποία προσφέρεται σαν federal, αλλά δεν θεωρούμε ότι αυτό θα σταματήσει τον πόλεμο στην Ουκρανία, δεν θα λύσει τα προβλήματα σε εφοδιαστικές αλυσίδες, δεν θα σταματήσει τα stock buybacks. Για να πω μία τι είναι τα stock buybacks, επειδή το έχουν πει 2-3 φορές και το χρειαστούμε και στη συνέχεια, για να σας εξηγήσω κάτι άλλο. Τα stock buybacks είναι όταν μια εταιρεία έχει κέρδη, αυτά τα κέρδη αντί να τα επενδύσει είτε σε R&D, είτε σε μεγαλύτερη παραγωγή, είτε σε περισσότερους ανθρώπους, ή δεν ξέρω και εγώ σε τι άλλο, σε επέκταση της εταιρείας, τα επενδύει έτσι ώστε να πάρει πίσω μετοχές της, το οποίο σημαίνει ότι ανεβάζει την τιμή των μετοχών της. Λέει ότι αυτά τα προβλήματα δεν θα λυθούν. Για να δούμε μια
And that's the holistic review that Senator Britt just brought up that Vice Chair Bauer is conducting right now. It's generating a sense that higher capital requirements are on the horizon for us. And as I think about that in the context of what we've weathered, you think about the situation in 2020. It was an acute, real-life stress test, if you will. And I think that our financial system navigated that admirably. In the past, Chair Powell, you've told this committee that our financial system has proven resilient through 2020, and that the capital levels at that point in time, and I would note that those capital levels are at multi-decade highs, are in aggregate adequate. And I just wanted to follow up on those prior statements and see if you still feel that way.
So I guess I would say it to you this way. In our system, we have a vice chair for supervision who has statutory responsibilities, and when a new vice chair for supervision comes in, generally they're going to want to take a fresh look. That's what the former one, Vice Chair Quarles did, and that's Dan Tarullo kind of had the job on an informal basis, and that's what he did. So it's only natural that someone would come in and take a fresh look, and I think that's part of the process. The role of that person is to make recommendations on regulation and supervision to the full board. The role of the board is to consider those when made, and to me, this just comes under that heading.
Well, as the review is underway, and I appreciate that context, one aspect of it seems to us as an apparent willingness to undo the tailoring requirements that were enacted as part of S2155. And I understand that nothing has been finalized regarding the regulations. It's a concerning prospect if that's the case. The Fed's General Counsel just yesterday alluded to undoing 2155 by, quote, pushing down the Basel requirements on banks that were intentionally given relief in the bill. So I want to be perfectly clear that the banking regulators themselves can't just simply ignore or selectively enforce the laws. And again, I realize that the details of the study haven't been finalized and made public, but if the proposal put forth by Vice Chair Barr is either unduly aggressive or appears to contradict the spirit of S2155, will you vote for it?
I can't answer that in the abstract, of course, but I would say we're, as an institution, very strongly committed to tailoring, And anything we do is going to reflect, tailoring of institutions according to their risk. And I mean, that's a principle that we'll stick with.
I think it's quite important, again, given the legislative intent here and the concerns that we maintain that in the face of what General Counsel said just yesterday. I appreciate your perspective in terms of keeping that in place. I'd like to come with my next question, Chairman Powell, with starting the question by underscoring the importance of the independence of the Fed's monetary policy. Right now, the economic picture is about as uncertain as I can remember. We've had large companies in the private sector who are in the midst of planning layoffs and forecasting serious economic weakness in the quarters to come. Yet, on the other hand, the current economic data seems to be robust. Inflation showed some signs of softening in the past several releases. So I just hope, Chair Powell, that you could briefly tell us how you synthesize these seemingly contradictory data.
So just quickly, at the end of last year, we saw a couple of very promising, modest inflationary readings in November and December. But earlier this year, some of that improvement was revised away. In addition, we got a very strong reading on inflation in January, also a very strong jobs reading, also very strong retail sales. So, as I pointed out in my testimony, we're looking at a reversal, really, of what we thought we were seeing to some extent, a partial reversal. It's still true that we're seeing progress on inflation. We're seeing goods inflation has come down significantly. There's improvement in housing inflation in the pipeline. There's not a lot of improvement yet to be seen in the largest sector, which is non-housing services. So core inflation is running at 4.7% on a 12-month basis. I think nothing about the data suggests to me that we've tightened too much. Indeed, it suggests that we still have work to do.
In that context, thinking about where the tightening goes and when it might, where and when it might happen, where do you see the terminal Fed funds rate landing in this cycle?
So we last wrote down our assessments, individual assessments of that in December, and I think the median range was basically people were clustered between 5 and 5.5. We're going to write down those again. As part of them, we do it 4 times a year. We'll do it around the March meeting, which is on the 21st and 22nd of March. As I indicated in my testimony, I think the data we've seen so far, and we still have other data to see, we still have significant data to see before the meeting, suggests that the ultimate rate that we write down may well be higher than what we wrote down in December.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Jerome.
Thank you.
Δεν έδωσε νούμερο. Τον ρώτησε πόσο θεωρείτε ότι είναι τελικά επιτόκιο το οποίο θα φτάσει και λέει θα το δείτε σε 2 εβδομάδες από τώρα, γιατί έχουμε και άλλα data να πάρουμε.
Interest rates 8 times over the last year in what has been the most extreme rate hike cycle in 40 years. The Fed's goal is to slow inflation, and your tool, raising interest rates, is designed to slow the economy and throw people out of work. So far, you haven't tipped the economy into recession, but you haven't brought inflation entirely under control either. And maybe the reason for that is that other things are also keeping prices high, things you can't fix with high interest rates, things like price gouging and supply chain kinks and a war in Ukraine. But you are determined to continue to raise interest rates, so I want to take a look at where you're headed. In December, the Fed released its projections on the state of the economy under your monetary policy plan. According to the Fed's own report, if you continue raising interest rates as you plan, unemployment will be 4.6% by the end of the year, more than a full point higher than it is today. Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an intended consequence.
But it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs, people who are working right now, making their mortgages. So, Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year, what would you say to them? How would you explain your view that they need to lose their jobs?
I would explain to people more broadly that inflation is extremely high, and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation, and we are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it?
Will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Let me ask you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year, exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as it, very,
Just
very
looking
infrequent.
at the numbers, it actually is pretty black
Alan
and white.
Blinder's written a book on this.
There have been 12 times that we've seen a 1-point increase in the unemployment rate in a year. That's exactly what your Fed report has put out as the projection and the plan based on how you're going to keep raising these interest rates. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a recession after doing that? Out of 12 times.
I think the number is 0.
I think the number is 0. That's exactly right. So then the question becomes, we've got 2 million people out of work. Can you stop it at 2 million people? History suggests that the Fed has a terrible track record of containing modest increases in the unemployment rate. It's kind of like a runaway train. It is really hard to stop. In fact, in 11 out of the 12 times that the unemployment rate increased by a full percentage point within 1 year, unemployment went on to rise another full percentage point on top of that. If that's what happens this time, we'd be looking at least 3.5 million people who would lose their jobs. So, Chair Powell, if you reach your goal and 2 million people get laid off by the end of this year, and then, just like in 11 out of 12 times that unemployment has risen by a point in a single year, it keeps on rising. And then we've got 2.5 million people out of work. We've got 3 million people who get laid off. We've got 3.5 million people who get laid off. What's your plan?
Well, right now the unemployment rate is 3.4%, which is the lowest in 54 years. And we actually don't think that we need to see a sharp or enormous increase in unemployment to get inflation under control.
I'm looking at your projections. Do you call laying off 2 million people this year not a sharp increase in unemployment?
I would say 4.5%.
Explain that to the 2 million families who are going to be out of work.
We're not targeting any of that. But I would say even 4.5% unemployment is well better than most of the time for the last 75 years.
In other words, you don't have a plan to stop a runaway train if it occurs. Chair Powell, you are gambling with people's lives, and there's a pile of data showing that price gouging and supply chain kinks and the war in Ukraine are driving up prices. You cling to the idea that there's only one solution: lay off millions of workers. We need a Fed that will fight for families, and if you're not going to lead that charge, we need someone at the Fed who will.
Άντε και σου ρε, εμείς μια χαρά τον συμπαθούμε.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, thanks so much for being here. I have a question that's...
Τι λέει αυτή ρε, να διώξουμε τον Powell.
How often you get to talk to the Federal Reserve Chairman, so I might as well ask it. So to give some context here, my family comes from Appalachia. Particularly my grandparents grew up in southeastern Kentucky, coal country, and then moved to southern Ohio, where I now have the honor of representing all of Ohio. And one of the things that you hear a lot when you study the regional history of Appalachia is it's often described as possessing resources, right? So there's a lot of coal in central Appalachia that enables consumption. Obviously, consumption is good. People need food and medicine and other things. But there's also a pretty good argument that for a host of reasons, it causes malinvestment in the region, and consequently, you have lower productivity growth, lower innovation, and an economy that's much less diversified and much less dynamic. I'm wondering, when I hear about the history, when I think about and read about the history of Appalachia and the resource curse, I'm struck by by the idea that you could make a similar argument about the reserve currency status of the United States dollar. Americans have enjoyed one of the greatest privileges of the international economy for the last nearly 8 decades, a strong dollar that acts, of course, as the world's reserve currency. You know that better than I do. Now, this has obviously been great for American purchasing power. We enjoy cheaper imports, Americans, when they travel abroad, benefit from lower costs. But it does come at a cost to American producers. I think in some ways you can argue that the reserve currency status is a massive subsidy to American consumers, but a massive tax on American producers. Now, I know the strong dollar is sort of a sacred cow of the Washington consensus, but when I survey the American economy and I see our mass consumption of mostly useless imports on the one hand and our hollowed out industrial base on the other hand, I wonder if the reserve currency status also has some downsides and not just some upsides as well. And let me just put a final point on this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that, Chairman Powell. We're, of course, now the main supporter of a massive land war in Europe between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I read recently, and I'm not going to comment on how perfect or precise these estimates are, but I read recently that the United States is trying to ramp up production from 14,000 artillery shells to 20,000 artillery shells. That's per month, while the Russians are firing 20,000 artillery shells in Ukraine per day. And when I look at the American economy, we have a lot of financial engineers and a lot of diversity consultants. We don't have a lot of people making things. And I worry that the reserve currency status and the lack of control we have over our currency is perhaps driving that. I'd love to get your feedback on that. What are the upsides and downsides of the reserve currency?
That's a big question to try to answer.
You have 2 minutes, Chairman Powell, so plenty of time.
I can't even get started on that. So we are the world's reserve currency, of course, and that's because of our democratic institutions. It's because of our control over inflation over many, many, many years. The world trusts the rule of law in the United States, and those are the things.
Αυτά είναι για imports και τέτοια πράγματα. Okay, για το reserve currency. Λοιπόν, πάμε να συνεχίσουμε σε αυτό που λέγαμε πριν. Δεν θεωρώ ότι έχει πολύ μεγάλη αξία αυτό. Το τωρινό. Οπότε, ναι. Σας είπα ότι είναι τα stock buybacks γιατί χρησιμεύουν. Ο Powell ήταν η δήλωση την οποία έκανε που λέει ότι αν τα δεδομένα έρθουν χειρότερα είμαστε έτοιμοι να συνεχίσουμε σε 50 μονάδες βάσης. Γι' αυτό είδαμε και αυτήν εδώ την αύξηση που σας είπα ότι σιγά σιγά θα αρχίσουμε να τη βλέπουμε. Βλέπετε ότι πλέον είμαστε παραπάνω. Ο κόσμος θεωρεί ότι θα πάρουμε 50 μονάδες βάσης παρά 25. Εντάξει, αυτό θα έχει και πολύ μεγάλη σημασία και από τα δεδομένα των επόμενων εβδομάδων. Γενικά, δεν είναι κάτι το οποίο θα είναι flat αναγκαστικά.
And keeping price stability, which you can here.
Όλο το υπόλοιπο λοιπόν κομμάτι είναι ότι είπε και πάλι τα νούμερα των τελευταίων μηνών είναι πολύ καλά, τα τελευταία νούμερα που είδαμε ήταν κακά, αυτά που τα έχουμε σχολιάσει αρκετές φορές γενικότερα. Κάτι άλλο το οποίο είπε είναι ότι θεωρούμε ότι υπάρχει μεγάλο lag σχετικά με την πραγματική, με τις πράξεις τις οποίες παίρνουμε εμείς και τα επιτόκια μέχρι να βαρέσουν την πραγματική οικονομία. Οπότε αυτό το lag το βλέπουμε και τώρα που εμείς δεν έχουμε τόσο μεγάλη ταχύτητα σε αυξήσεις, αλλά βλέπουμε την οικονομία να πέφτει πάρα πολύ απότομα. Αυτό γίνεται και γιατί οι πράξεις οι οποίες κάναμε πριν από κάποιους μήνες τώρα αρχίζουν και έχουν μεγάλο impact στην οικονομία. Εάν δούμε χειρότερα νούμερα, είμαστε έτοιμοι να αυξήσουμε αυτό που είπαμε και πριν 50 μονάδες. Κουλουπού. Το ρώτησε ο πρώτος το This time is different και είπε ο Πάουλ ότι ναι, θεωρούμε ότι έχει πολύ μεγάλες διαφορές η συγκεκριμένη κατάσταση στην οποία ζούμε τώρα με αυτή που ήταν από προηγούμενες μήνες και από προηγούμενες υφέσεις. Τελειώνω αυτό και το πάμε εδώ. Αλλά έχει και πολλά κοινά. Οι διαφορές μας μπορεί να έχει σχέση με εφοδιαστικές αλυσίδες και τους πολέμους και την ενέργεια, αλλά έχει και πάρα πολλά κοινά όσον αφορά το οικονομικό σύστημα. Και λέει το πρόβλημα είναι για μας ότι έχουμε τα ίδια ακριβώς εργαλεία για να αντιμετωπίσουμε αυτή την κατάσταση.
Recently, we saw that the employment cost index, which, as you know, measures the growth of wages and benefit costs, grew at roughly 4% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter of 2022. Is that right?
That's my recollection, yes.
So if corporate profits were to decline from the extremely high levels that we saw recently, would it be possible to sustain the 4% growth rate in the employment cost index for an extended period of time, even as we get inflation down to the target of 2%?
Depends on what you mean by extended period of time. So you would not, without a very, very large increase in productivity, which would be great, but that we don't expect, you wouldn't be able to sustain 4% wage inflation over the longer term. Over the shorter term, though, yes.
So over the shorter term, that would not be a justification in and of itself for raising rates. Is that right, in the short term?
Well, I think wages affect prices and prices affect wages. I think we do think that some softening in labor market conditions will happen as we try to get inflation under control, and will need to happen.
Right, but that's more a prediction about your efforts to fight inflation. Are you saying that simply looking at the current 4% growth rate in the short term is an excuse for jacking up interest rates?
I think what I would say is that the overall, all the data we look at in the labor market, including not just that measure of wages, but others, also unemployment, also participation, also job openings and quits and things like that. All of that, you put that into the picture, and I think you see a labor market that is extremely tight and is probably contributing to inflation. I've never said it was the main cause.
Right. I think the larger point here, based on your response to that first question about growth in profits, is corporations have a decision as to whether or not they're going to pocket more for profit, which they can, or provide higher wages to their employees.
Για εταιρείες θέλει να μιλήσει για εταιρικά κόστη και για αυτό που είπαμε και πριν για τα stock buybacks. Οπότε πάμε να το συνεχίσουμε, γιατί θα το μιλήσω και αυτό για το κομμάτι stock buybacks. Λοιπόν, οπότε τώρα λοιπόν πάμε να δούμε τα προβλήματα τα οποία υπάρχουν. Ένα πρόβλημα το οποίο ανέφερε είναι αυτό που είπαμε για τα stock buybacks. Και εκτός από αυτό λοιπόν, είπε ότι θεωρούμε ότι ένα μεγάλο ρίσκο για την αμερικανική οικονομία είναι και η χαμηλή ρευστότητα σε τράπεζες. Και τον ρώτησαν αν μπορεί να εγγυηθεί η Fed ότι οι τράπεζες δεν θα ξεμείνουν από ρευστό. AKA, πείτε ότι μια τράπεζα έχει πρόβλημα και χρειάζεται να σωθεί. Θα τη σώσετε? Ο Πάουλ απάντησε ξεκάθαρα, ναι, αν χρειαστεί θα κάνουμε bailout για οποιαδήποτε τράπεζα. Σας διαβεβαιώνω ότι θα κρατήσουμε τη ρευστότητα στις τράπεζες. Οπότε εκεί μπορεί να είναι και ένα μεγάλο turning point που να δείξει πιθανό πάτο για το χρηματιστήριο, εάν, ξαναλέω, γίνει κάτι τέτοιο για κάποια τράπεζα, γιατί πολλές φορές τα bailouts τα οποία έχουν έρθει και το 2008 και το 2000 και το 80 και το 70 που ήταν πάνω σε τράπεζες, είδαμε να δίνουν ακριβώς και τους πάτους. Προς το παρόν δεν έχουμε βέβαια τέτοιο θέμα, απλώς το συζητάνε, λένε ότι είναι ένα ρίσκο, αλλά αυτό είναι έτσι κάτι που καλό είναι να το έχουμε και στο μακρινό πίσω μέρος του μυαλού μας. Αλλά ο Πάουελ εξασφάλισε τουλάχιστον το κομμάτι του bailout. Τον ρώτησαν και στην αρχή, αν θυμάστε λίγο, για τα κρύπτο και είπε ότι το μεγαλύτερο πρόβλημα που βρίσκουμε με τα κρύπτο είναι τα προβλήματα διαφάνειας που μπορεί να υπάρχουν και δουλεύουμε μαζί με το FDIC και το SEC έτσι ώστε να τους δίνουμε κι εμείς την ειδική μας εικόνα σχετικά με το κομμάτι του πώς μπορούν έτσι να διαχειριστούν όλη αυτή την κατάσταση και να έχουμε μεγαλύτερη διαφάνεια στο χώρο. Μετά λοιπόν συνεχίσανε με το ότι επόμενες ερωτήσεις, επόμενη ερώτηση για ακρίβεια ήταν το ερώτηση. Επόμενος άνθρωπος που μίλησε, σε αυτό που αναφέρθηκε ήταν ότι έχει πέσει ο ρυθμός αυξήσεων, ο ρυθμός ανόδου των μισθών και ταυτόχρονα ο πληθωρισμός ανεβαίνει. Οπότε από τη στιγμή που πέφτει η ταχύτητα αύξηση των μισθών και ανεβαίνει ο πληθωρισμός, αυτό δημιουργεί ακόμα μεγαλύτερο πραγματικό πρόβλημα για τον απλό πολίτη που πληρώνει τα αγαθά του κάθε μέρα. Και ένα σχόλιο το οποίο έγινε εκεί είναι ότι ακόμα περισσότεροι Αμερικάνοι πολίτες γυρνάνε σε πιστωτικές κάρτες και γι' αυτό είδαμε και το credit, τις πιστώσεις οι οποίες υπάρχουν στην Αμερική να είναι στα υψηλότερα επίπεδα σχεδόν που έχουμε δει ever. Και τον ρώτησαν αν η διοίκηση Biden θεωρεί ότι τους έχει δεσμεύσει τα χέρια στην Fed και δεν μπορεί ο Πάουλ να χρησιμοποιήσει όλα τα όπλα της Fed. Και η απάντηση του Πάουλ είναι ότι δεν θεωρούμε ότι πρέπει να ρίξουμε ευθύνες σε κάποια συγκεκριμένα, αλλά θεωρούμε ότι έχουμε αρκετά εργαλεία για να τα καταπολεμήσουμε.
Won't do.
Raising interest rates won't fill in the blank. I'm going to fill in the blank with a couple things. How about raising interest rates won't stop Senate Democrats and President Biden from overtaxing, overspending, overborrowing, overregulating. Chairman.
Okay. Θα μιλήσουμε πάλι για Biden και για regulations και δεν ξέρω γιατί, και για taxing αυτή τη φορά. Συνέχεια λοιπόν είπε ότι θεωρείται ότι έχετε περιορισμένα εργαλεία και η κυβέρνηση, άρα του είπε άλλη συμπερασματικά ότι θεωρείται ότι και τα εργαλεία που έχετε είναι κάπως σε έναν βαθμό περιορισμένα και η κυβέρνηση δεν σας βοηθάει. Θα σας βοηθούσε, του λέει, αν γινόταν κάτι σχετικά με την ενέργεια, τύπου μεγαλύτερη παραγωγή ενέργειας. Και λέει ναι, ο Πάουελ θα βοηθούσε, αλλά κοιτάμε το core CPI μας, το οποίο έχει πέσει, αλλά όχι όσο θέλουμε. Το οποίο είναι το σχόλιο που έκανε και πριν, ότι και το σχολίασε και νομίζω η κυρία εδώ με το ροζ, που βλέπουμε και τώρα στην οθόνη, ότι ναι, το core CPI μπορεί να δείχνει λίγο, να βγάζει την καθαρή ενέργεια από τη μέση, αλλά και πάλι ό,τι παράγουμε και δουλεύουμε και τα πάντα χρησιμοποιεί ενέργεια, από ηλεκτρική ενέργεια μέχρι το οτιδήποτε μπορεί να είναι σε πετρέλαιο ή κάτι τέτοιο, οπότε έχει πολύ μεγάλη, είναι πολύ δύσκολο να αποκλείσει εντελώς τα αποτελέσματα του ενεργειακού πληθωρισμού και λέει ότι σίγουρα θα βοηθούσε. Τρίτη κουβέντα έτσι που είχε, τον ρώτησε αν το δολάριο είναι το παγκόσμιο αποθεματικό, η απάντηση ήταν ναι. Λέει έχει πολλά θετικά το να είναι το δολάριο το παγκόσμιο αποθεματικό για όντας Αμερικάνοι εκείνοι, για εμάς συσσαγωγικά, για εκείνους δηλαδή. Του λέει ναι, θεωρώ ότι έχει πολλά θετικά. Και λέει τι μπορεί να σημαίνει ένα debt default. Τι είναι το debt default? Το debt default είναι αυτό που έπαθε η Ελλάδα που δεν πλήρωσε το χρέος της το 2012, όχι, 15, πότε ήταν αυτό, που απλώς δεν πληρώσαμε το κομμάτι του χρέους που ήταν και στις τηλεοράσεις και τέτοια. Αυτό είναι ένα debt default, το οποίο σημαίνει ότι η οποιαδήποτε χώρα δεν πληρώνει το χρέος το οποίο της αναλογεί. Η απάντηση σε αυτό είναι ότι αυτό μπορεί να διαλύσει γενικά μια οικονομία, να μειώσει πάρα πολύ κιόλας, ειδικά αν μια οικονομία, μιλάμε και για ένα central currency, αν είναι και ένα κεντρικό νόμισμα τύπου ευρώ, τύπου δολάριο, τύπου γεν, κάτι τέτοιο, μπορεί να πιέσει πάρα πολύ το συγκεκριμένο νόμισμα σε βαθμό που να του μειώσει πάρα πολύ την αξία έως και να το καταστρέψει, ένα debt default. Και επίσης ο Πάουελ είπε ότι η μόνη λύση, βάσιμη λύση, και το είχε ξαναφέρει αυτό και στην προηγούμενη ομιλία του, η μόνη βάσιμη λύση για να μην υπάρξει κάτι τέτοιο, για να μην υπάρξει το debt default, είναι να ανέβει το όριο χρέους της Αμερικής, το οποίο σημαίνει ότι μπορούν να διαχειριστούν με συσσαγωγικά λίγο εκτύπωση χρήματος ή μετακίνηση του balance sheet. Μπορεί να γίνει, αυτό είναι λίγο πιο τεχνικό, δεν θα μπω σε αυτή τη διαδικασία να το αναλύσω τώρα. Θέλει και πολύ παραπάνω γνώση. Είναι και λίγο, πώς να το πω, νερντουλίστικο για τα οικονομικά, οπότε δεν νομίζω ότι θα έχει και πολύ ενδιαφέρον για τους περισσότερους. Για το πώς μπορεί να γίνει αυτό μέσω του balance. Οπότε αυτό ήταν και το κομμάτι για το debt default. Επόμενο σχόλιο το οποίο έχει γίνει είναι το ότι εάν η κυβέρνηση με την πολιτική της σας έχει βοηθήσει και αν θεωρείτε ότι μπορεί να προσφέρει κάποια βοήθεια, λέει, ο Πάουελ είπε ότι θεωρούμε ότι η κυβέρνηση θέλει να συνεχίσει την άνοδο του ΑΕΠ, το να συνεχίσει να υπάρχει growth. Αυτό σίγουρα δεν είναι κάτι. Όχι, αυτό δεν έγινε από τον σχολείο του Πάουελ, έγινε από ομιλητή. Είπε ότι η κυβέρνηση, αυτό που παρατηρούμε εμείς, είναι ότι θέλει να συνεχίσει να αναπτύσσει το growth, να αναπτύσσει το ΑΕΠ της. Έτσι. Και ταυτόχρονα εσείς ανεβάζετε τα επιτόκια, οπότε η μία κίνηση είναι σαν εξουδετερώνει την άλλη, χωρίς καμία από τις δύο εν τέλει να βοηθάνε στον τελικό στόχο που είναι η μείωση του πληθωρισμού. Οπότε είπαν ότι θεωρούμε ότι πιθανώς να χρειάζεται και η βοήθεια της πολιτικής, της κυβέρνησης, έτσι ώστε να είναι στην ίδια γραμμή με την Federal και να συνεχίσουμε την μείωση του πληθωρισμού. Και μετά λοιπόν ήταν αυτά τα ιδιαίτερα νούμερα τα οποία ανέφερε ο μιλητής, νομίζω ήταν ο Kennedy ο οποίος το είχε μιλήσει, αν θυμάμαι καλά, και είπε ότι το CPI τώρα λέει είναι 6,4% και η ανεργία είναι στο 3,4%. και λέει ιστορικά, αυτό βέβαια έγινε αναλογικά και γι' αυτό σας είπα πριν ότι δεν είναι ακριβώς έτσι και θα το εξηγήσω λίγο τώρα. Είπε λοιπόν ότι ιστορικά θα πρέπει έτσι ώστε το CPI να πάει στο 4,4%, να κατέβει από το 6,4 και να πάει στο 4,4, θα πρέπει η ανεργία να διπλασιαστεί. Δηλαδή να κατέβει 2% το CPI, πρέπει η ανεργία να διπλασιαστεί. Δηλαδή να πάει στο 7%. Ένα λεπτάκι.
I said it in the previous administration, I say it now, we cannot be playing politics with our economy.
Η αλήθεια είναι ότι νομίζω ότι την ομιλία την αφήσουμε κάπου εδώ, γιατί νομίζω ότι μπαίνουμε στη διαδικασία να μιλάνε και λίγο για περισσότερο πολιτικό κατάσταση. Τα σημαντικά νομίζω τα έχουν πει προς το παρόν. Οπότε δεν ξέρω αν έχει ιδιαίτερο αξία από εδώ και πέρα απλώς να ακούμε τον καθένα, γιατί πριν μιλήσαν, ξέρω εγώ, για, πώς το λένε, για regulations και για taxes. Οπότε θα κάνουμε λίγο το sum up μας. Να συνεχίσω το sum up. Ναι, είπε λοιπόν ότι αν τον πληθωρισμό από 6,4 τον ρίξουμε στο 4,4, θα πρέπει να ανεβάσουμε την ανεργία στο 7%, που είναι στο 3,4 αυτή τη στιγμή, οπότε να το διπλασιάσουμε. Και είπε ότι για να ρίξουμε και τον πληθωρισμό στο 2%, με αυτό το κάνουμε αναλογικά, η ανεργία θα πρέπει να πάει προς το 10% και του λέει συμφωνείτε με αυτό ή όχι. Και είπε ο Πάουελ ότι όχι, δεν συμφωνώ με αυτό, και του είπε ο άλλος ότι ναι, ok, αλλά εμείς αυτό βλέπουμε, ξέρω εγώ, αναλογικά και με βάση και την ιστορία. Ο λόγος που δεν συμφωνώ, παιδιά, με αυτό είναι γιατί πολλά νούμερα στην οικονομία δεν λειτουργούν αναλογικά, λειτουργούν εκθετικά. Δηλαδή, εάν εκτυπώσουμε, λέω εγώ τώρα, όπως είχαμε τώρα, εάν εκτυπώσουμε, είδατε ότι εκτυπώσαμε το 2020-2021, ότι εκτυπώσαμε το 1/3 από το συνολικό money supply το οποίο υπήρχε. Το οποίο θεωρητικά τι θα έπρεπε, αν το πάρουμε αναλογικά, τι θα έπρεπε, να ανεβάσει τον πληθωρισμό κατά 30%. Αυτό το νούμερο, αναλογικά λοιπόν, σε πραγματική βάση αν το δούμε, δεν ήταν αυτό που ήρθε. Δεν θα μιλήσω για το ότι κάποια προϊόντα μπορεί να έχουν ανέβει και 100% ή όχι, αλλά το νούμερο το οποίο πήραμε, το νούμερο το οποίο πήραμε ήταν 10% πληθωρισμός, max, με 30% παραπάνω χρήμα. Αυτό είναι που προσπαθώ να σας πω, ότι πολλά νούμερα στην οικονομία δεν είναι αναλογικά, δεν είναι τριπλασιάζω το ένα, άρα υποτριπλασιάζω το άλλο, είναι εκθετικά. Μπορεί να τριπλασιάζεται το ένα και το άλλο να υποεξαπλασιάζεται. Είναι διαφορετικού βεληνικούς. Οπότε δεν σημαίνει ότι κάθε φορά που πρέπει εμείς να ρίχνουμε τον πληθωρισμό 2%, αυτό πρέπει να διπλασιάζουμε σε έναν βαθμό την ανεργία ή κάτι τέτοιο. Οπότε εκεί δεν συμφωνώ με αυτό το κομμάτι. Σίγουρα και το 7% ανεργία δεν είναι κάτι το οποίο θέλει η Fed και κανένας για την ακριβή κυβέρνηση. Απλώς ήθελα να το εξηγήσω λίγο για το πώς δουλεύουν και κάποια νούμερα. Και πάμε λοιπόν, γιατί εδώ ήταν που έκλεισε η μπαταρία του pen. Οπότε πάμε λίγο να σας πω κάποια άλλα σχόλια τα οποία έχω κρατήσει. Είπε λοιπόν, τον ρώτησε το τι θα κοιτάτε φέτος σαν federal όσον αφορά τα νούμερα, και αυτό λοιπόν που του είπε κυρίως ότι θα κοιτάνε όσον αφορά τον πληθωρισμό είναι το good services, αυτό που έχουμε πει, τα καταναλωτικά προϊόντα, το τι γίνεται με τον πληθωρισμό στα καταναλωτικά προϊόντα, που είπε ότι θεωρούμε ότι ήδη έχουμε δει μεγάλη πρόοδο και θεωρούμε ότι ήδη έτσι έχει πέσει εκεί ο πληθωρισμός. Το housing sector, γενικά το real estate και όλο αυτό το κομμάτι, η αγορά κινήτων, που λέει ότι έχουμε δει και εκεί πρόοδο, δεν έχει τελειώσει και θεωρούμε ότι έτσι κι αλλιώς είναι από τους τελευταίους τομείς, αλλά θεωρούμε ξεκάθαρα ότι έχουμε δει και εκεί πρόοδο και η πρόοδος αυτή θα συνεχίσει να πηγαίνει προς το καλύτερο. Οπότε και σε αυτό ένα μικρό check. Και λέει εκεί που δεν έχουμε δει καθόλου πρόοδο και πρέπει να δούμε είναι το service sector, ο τομέας υπηρεσιών. Ξαναλέω πολύ απλά, ένας γιατρός, ένας δικηγόρος, το τι χρεώνει ή το οτιδήποτε. Που είπε κιόλας ότι αυτό το νούμερο, το service sector, αυτός ο τομέας για την ακρίβεια, είναι το 56% του CPI. Δίνει 56% από όλη τη βαρύτητα των τομέων στο CPI. Και εκεί λέει ότι δεν έχουμε αποτέλεσμα, οπότε εκεί θέλουμε να εστιάσουμε και περισσότερο στο 2023. Είπε, όπως είχε πει και νωρίτερα, ότι η νομισματική πολιτική ότι έχει κάποια καθυστέρηση με την πραγματική οικονομία και ότι δεν έχουμε δει την πλήρη ισχύ των πράξεων και των αποφάσεων που έχει πάρει η Fed στην πραγματική οικονομία. Τον ρώτησαν επίσης εάν παράξουμε παραπάνω ενέργεια θα σας βοηθούσε και είπε ξεκάθαρα ναι, θα πέφτανε οι τιμές της ενέργειας, αλλά εμείς κοιτάμε το core που είναι εκεί που τον σχολίασε η άλλη και του λέει ναι, αλλά οι τιμές της ενέργειας μπαίνουν παντού. Οπότε ναι, θα μας βοηθούσε να υπάρξει μεγαλύτερη παραγωγή ενέργειας από την πλευρά της Αμερικής. Εν συνεχεία είπε ότι θεωρούμε ότι χρειάζονται μεγαλύτερες, σαν κογκρέσο λένε ότι θεωρούμε ότι χρειάζονται μεγαλύτερες απαιτήσεις σε ρευστό, κυρίως σε τράπεζες και τέτοιους τομείς. Οπότε λέει ότι πήραμε πολύ καλά νούμερα στο τέλος του 2022. Στις αρχές του 2023 είπε ο Powell επίσης ότι δεν έχουμε πάρει τόσο καλά νούμερα. Και αυτό που βλέπουμε, γι' αυτό σας σχολίασα και πριν, είναι αυτό που είπε partial reversal. Μια μερική αλλαγή τάσης στο κομμάτι του πληθωρισμού. Το οποίο σημαίνει ότι ότι ακόμα πιστεύουν ότι μπορεί να δούμε 1-2 μήνες ίσως να ανεβαίνει ο πληθωρισμός ή γενικά τα νούμερα να μην έρχονται τόσο καλά, αλλά θεωρεί ότι το ευρύτερο trend ότι έχει αλλάξει, ότι όλα έχουν μπει σε μια σχετικά καλύτερη τάση, ουσιαστικά ότι έχουμε δει το peak του πληθωρισμού, πιθανώς αυτό να σημαίνει ότι είδαμε και τον πάτο του χρηματιστηρίου. Δεν είναι αναγκαστικό ότι αυτά τα δύο πρέπει να συμβαδίζουν, γιατί όπως είπαμε μπορεί να υπάρξει το οποιοδήποτε πρόβλημα ρευστότητας από τράπεζες, από το οτιδήποτε, από default, αλλά θεωρητικά αν αυτά τα δύο τα συνδυάσουμε θα μπορούμε να βγάλουμε ένα συμπέρασμα ότι έχουμε δει τον υψηλό του πληθωρισμό με βάση το συγκεκριμένο σχόλιο, το οποίο σημαίνει ότι μπορεί να έχουμε δει και τον πάτο του χρηματιστηρίου. Επίσης είπε ότι τα data, όμως τα data τα οποία έχουμε δεν δείχνουν ότι έχουμε υπερσυσφίξη, γιατί αρκετοί του λένε μήπως έχετε κάνει ήδη over-tightening, μήπως έχετε κάνει over-tightening. Είπε ο Powell ότι δεν θεωρούμε ότι τα data τα οποία έχουμε πάρει, ότι έχουμε με βάση τα data τα οποία έχουμε πάρει, ότι έχουμε υπερσυσφίξη. Ίσα ίσα θεωρούμε ότι έχουμε ακόμα δρόμο να ανέβει κι άλλο η σύσφυξη η οποία προσπαθούμε εμείς να κάνουμε. Στη συνέχεια λοιπόν, έτσι προς το τέλος, ήταν η τελευταία που του μίλησε, που υπήρχε αυτός ο έντονος διάλογος, που είπε ότι αν συνεχίσετε έτσι με βάση τις αυτής επιτοκίων και με την πολιτική την οποία έχετε επιλέξει, με την πολιτική σύσφυξης που έχετε επιλέξει, ότι η ανεργία με τα δικά σας δεδομένα και το δικό σας forecast θα φτάσει στο 4,6% μέχρι το τέλος του 2023, ότι αυτό κάνετε forecast. Και του είπε λοιπόν ότι αυτό το 4,6% είναι 2 εκατομμύρια άνθρωποι οι οποίοι θα χάσουν τις δουλειές τους μέχρι το τέλος του 2023. Επίσης, η ανεργία τώρα, να πούμε ότι είναι στο 3,4%, γιατί έκανε το σχόλιο, οπότε 3,4 με 4,6 μέχρι το τέλος του χρόνου σημαίνει συν 1,2. Η επόμενη ερώτησή της λοιπόν ήταν ότι πόσες φορές στην ιστορία η ανεργία έχει ανέβει 1% ή περισσότερο μέσα σε ένα χρόνο και δεν είχαμε ύφεση. Η απάντηση του Powell ήταν ότι αυτό δεν έχει γίνει ποτέ, ότι όποτε η ανεργία έχει ανέβει πάνω από 1% μέσα σε έναν μόλις χρόνο, ότι η οικονομία έχει γυρίσει σε ύφεση. Και λέει ότι επίσης 11 από τις 12 φορές που ιστορικά αναφέραμε ότι έχει ανέβει πάνω από το 1%, η ανεργία δεν έχει σταματήσει ακριβώς σε αυτό το σημείο και έχει ανέβει και παραπάνω. Το οποίο αναλογικά λέει με βάση τη σημερινή κατάσταση και τα σημερινά νούμερα θα σήμαινε ότι περίπου η ανεργία θα έφτανε σε πραγματικό βαθμό, ότι θα έφτανε στα νούμερα τα οποία θα αντιστοιχούσαν σε περίπου 3,5 εκατομμύρια ανθρώπους άνεργους με βάση τα σημερινά δεδομένα. Επιπλέον άνεργους από σήμερα μέχρι τότε. Και του είπε λοιπόν, έκλεισε λέγοντάς του ότι θεωρούμε ότι πράγματα τα οποία κάνετε έχουν πολύ μεγάλη, πώς το λένε, μετράνε πάρα πολύ για τους πολίτες και λέει εμείς δεν θέλουμε έναν chairman στη Fed ο οποίος να τον ενδιαφέρει να μείνουν άνεργοι πολίτες. Βέβαια το μεγάλο point του Powell είναι ότι λέει ok, και η λύση σας είναι το να πρέπει να αφήσουμε ένα πληθωρισμό 10% και από το να θυσιάσουμε σε εισαγωγικά 2 εκατομμύρια εργαζομένους για το ευρύτερο καλό, δηλαδή θεωρείται ότι πρέπει να την πληρώνουν όλοι οι εργαζόμενοι της συγκεκριμένης χώρας. Η απάντηση ήταν ότι think out of the box και πρέπει να βρείτε λύση η οποία να βολεύει τους πάντες. Αυτή ήταν μέχρι στιγμής τα πολύ σημαντικά points τα οποία έχω δει. Ξαναλέω ότι από εδώ και πέρα δεν νομίζω ότι θα πούνε κάτι ιδιαίτερο. Δηλαδή και την προηγούμενη φορά που θυμάμαι ότι είχαμε την αντίστοιχη ομιλία, δεν είχαν πει κάτι από ένα σημείο και μετά, τουλάχιστον δεν είχαν κάνει σοβαρά points, οπότε κάπου εδώ, από το να κάτσουμε να το δω όλο αυτό το κομμάτι, θα το αφήσω και εννοείται ότι θα το κοιτάξω όμως και σε άρθρα και στο Twitter λίγο το τι γίνεται και εννοείται ότι αν έχω κάτι άλλο θα το σχολιάσουμε. Αύριο ξανά έχουν τέτοια ομιλία και νομίζω τα πιο σημαντικά τα είπαν σήμερα, οπότε θα δω και το πρωί το τι νέα θα υπάρχουν σχετικά με το πώς θα περιμέναμε ότι θα κινηθεί η αυριανή ομιλία και πιθανώς να κάνουμε και αύριο ένα αντίστοιχο στριμάκι. Όσον αφορά τώρα για το κομμάτι bullish ή bearish, παιδιά, ξαναλέω ότι εγώ αυτή την ομιλία την έχω ευχαριστηθεί πάρα πολύ. Δεν θεωρώ ότι είναι bearish η ομιλία, δεν θεωρώ ότι είναι bullish. Προφανώς ένα bearish σχόλιο το οποίο έχει ρίξει την κατάσταση είναι αυτό για τις 50 μονάδες βάσης, γιατί η αγορά δεν το υπολόγιζε καθόλου, αλλά αυτό ήταν εξ αρχής. Από εκεί και πέρα είναι μια πολύ ωραία ομιλία για κάποιον ο οποίος θέλει λίγο να αντιληφθεί και για το πού πάει λίγο η κατάσταση, για το προβλήματα τα οποία μπορεί να υπάρξουν, αλλά και για το τι μπορούμε να κοιτάμε μέσα στον επόμενο καιρό. Σίγουρα έχουμε και πολύ σημαντικά νούμερα αύριο να θυμίσω ότι 3 και 4 έχουμε τα ADP non-farm payrolls, τα employment change, με συγχωρείτε, και στις 5 έχουμε τα jobs, τα job openings, οπότε και αυτά σε συνδυασμό με την σημερινή ομιλία του Powell, σε συνδυασμό με την αυριανή ομιλία του Powell, καταλαβαίνετε ότι δημιουργούν έτσι μια πολύ volatile ατμόσφαιρα στο χρηματιστήριο, οπότε do your own research σε αυτό το κομμάτι. Θέλετε να είστε μέσα σε trades, δεν θέλετε, ο καθένας προφανώς κάνει θέλει. Εγώ θα πρότεινα να μην είστε την ώρα ακριβώς που γίνονται τα νέα, εκτός αν έχετε κάποιο πολύ καθαρό bias τεχνικό ή τριντάρετε αρκετό καιρό και νέα και έχετε την εμπειρία να το διαχειριστείτε. Αυτό. Οπότε, ναι, μάγκες, κάπου εδώ θα το κλείσουμε, γιατί και εγώ πεθαίνω από την πείνα. Ελπίζω να είδαμε πραγματάκια. Ξαναλέω ότι ό,τι έξτρα δω θα σας το αναφέρω και ό,τι έξτρα μάθω θα το αναφέρω και στο Twitter αλλά και στο Discord. Όλα τα πράγματα είναι στην περιγραφή. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την παρέα. Μ' αρέσει πάρα πολύ να παρακολουθώ τέτοια πράγματα και χαίρομαι που αρέσει και σε άλλο κόσμο που τη βλέπω και είστε εδώ να τα μοιραζόμαστε και σκέψεις, να τις έχουμε παρέα και να ανταλλάσσουμε τις σκέψεις μας. Να είστε καλά, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για τη στήριξη. Μην ξεχάσετε να κάνετε ένα sub στο κανάλι αν δεν έχετε κάνει. Ένα like εννοείται ότι βοηθάει πάρα πολύ με τον αλγόριθμο και θα τα πούμε αύριο ξανά, αντίστοιχη ώρα, να δούμε και την αυριανή ομιλία του Powell και σίγουρα να κάνουμε και 2-3 παραπάνω πραγματάκια στο κομμάτι του TA, αλλά δυστυχώς σήμερα δεν θα προλάβω να το κάνω. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, καλό απόγευμα, καλή συνέχεια σε όλους και καλά trades σε όλους.